So, official debate happening. We have Spaz and Cooldog. Spaz has taken the position that people voting would reject consensus. Cooldog has taken the opposition. For this debate, we're doing the Lincoln Douglas format, meaning we'll have an affirmative and a negative. They'll go back and forth. We'll start off with the affirmative constructive, which will be Spaz. Then at the end of his 6 minutes, I'll jump in and let him know that we have to move on to the cross-examination, so forth with the different areas throughout the format. Winner will be based upon who concedes. If we don't get a concession, we'll put it to a voting poll in which the audience can decide on who they think performed better overall in the debate. Thank you both for debating. Spaz, if you want to open up with your 6-minute affirmative constructive, you can go right ahead.
So before we do that, though, we're going to just define our terms.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I was just going to define consensus from, I think I might have got this from Merriam-Webster, but it's a group solidarity in sentiment and belief. Is that fair, you think?
That's fair.
And then when we talk about accepting or rejecting consensus, we're just talking about the value of consensus as a way of making decisions.
I'm perfectly fine with that.
Okay, cool. So I can go ahead and start. If you'll start the timer.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So I'm here to argue against the value of consensus, both in theory and in practice, as a way for groups of people to make decisions. We can define consensus as a group solidarity in sentiment and belief. A notable precondition for having consensus is that, of course, we have to have an issue that calls for some action, and we have to have a group of people who are going to discuss the issue and come to an agreement. I think there are two main reasons why people might value consensus. On the one hand, it's a known fact that groups a lot of times are smarter than individuals. A common example is that, say, if we have a group of people who are trying to estimate the number of gumballs in a jar, you're going to always get a more accurate result by taking the average of what everybody says than by trying to do any like fancy math in your head yourself. I don't think this reasoning really holds up because, in my view, just because we want to take multiple views into account doesn't necessarily mean that there's any value in actually in coming to an actual consensus. For example, there's been a really famous experiment called what was it called? The Ash conformity experiment. I was misspeaking there, where we notice that when there appears to be a consensus or when there appears to be a strong sentiment in one direction or another by a group of people, it actually undermines people's ability to make judgments at all. In my opinion, the most important thing when we're trying to come to a decision is for everybody to be able to use their own judgment and at least forming their initial impression. And then afterwards, we can come up with some way of deciding who's right. But I think we're risking damaging our ability to reason properly when we make it into a sort of political issue from the beginning. The other reason why people seem to like consensus is a sort of normative, like democratic reason. Like we want to think that if we have a group of people making a decision, then we're going to want to have everybody's input. We're going to want to come to a conclusion that benefits everybody. But I think there are pretty good arguments against that too. Like for example, there are some pretty good reasons why the United States Constitution was made to be a republic and not a democracy. Because there's a famous quote that, well, democracy and also consensus is just like two wolves and one sheep voting on what to have for dinner. And it's been accepted for a long time that direct democracy is actually not a viable form of government at all, because the process of coming to consensus is so intractable and can take such a long time, and might also have a negative effect of deepening divisions that might already exist between people or groups of people. So even though a government by consensus or a decision-making procedure that relies on consensus can stop some forms of tyranny, there are other forms of tyranny, like tyranny of the majority or tyranny of the mob, that are actually worsened by either democracy or by making decisions according to consensus. I don't know how much time I have left, but I can go ahead and waive it.
Okay, if you're all done, then Cooldog can come in with his 3-minute cross-examination.
Okay.
Yeah, so like my first question is I guess given a binary option, do you think that the okay, let's start the syllogism at this. So do you think that people are better at random at making a binary choice?
I'll say yes.
So they are. Do you grant that if
Well,
we
I would
had
hope so.
do you grant it with that the larger the set of people making this choice, the closer to the right answer we become?
Yes.
Okay, right? Do you concede that in America we have a two-party system?
Mm, yes.
So then it would seem that the majority will pick correctly from that binary option, right? When
That the
we expand
majority.
once we expand the set to include millions and millions and millions of voters, the chance that they picked correctly approaches basically to 1, the
Mm,
probability, right?
See, this presupposes that there's a correct answer. In my opinion, it seems likely that party politics a lot of times just depends on different people having different interests in the first place.
Do you believe that one choice for your vote will lead to a better society than the other choice?
Yes.
Okay. So then people on average, would you agree that people on average are more likely to make the choice that would improve society over making comparatively to the other choice?
Not necessarily. I think it
Okay.
depends on the option that's in front of them.
I guess we'll go to a different topic. So we've covered the democratic thing. Could you explain to me what this tyranny of majority is?
Okay. So a tyranny of majority is a situation where the majority of people have some sort of prejudice or some sort of interest in suppressing the rights of some minority group, which it could be an ethnic minority, religious minority. It could be
Is
just
Does this necessarily follow from consensus, or is only something that happens after the fact? Is it intrinsic to having consensus that this occurs?
no, it's not intrinsic.
Okay, so it's forms of consensus that are bad, or discourse norms that are bad, and not consensus proper, correct?
Mm, sure, I can say so. I just think it's
Okay.
probable. I think it's probable that putting a high value on consensus will lead most likely to some of these problems.
Okay. Um, I don't have any further questions at this point.
All right, cool, right on time. So do you want to move into your 7-minute negative constructive?
Yeah, you bet. Let me start my timer. Okay, you can count it off, Stone.
Count it off, sorry.
Yeah, you can give me like the 3, 2, 1.
Okay, yeah, you can go ahead starting now.
Okay, thank you everybody and my opponent for attending this debate. It's I hope that you're enjoying the case that was presented by my opponent, because I sure did. So the structure of my first constructive is going to be, I'm going to give 4 contentions for why we believe in the value of consensus, and then I'm going to go on his case and refute his points. So my first contention is, I kind of alluded to this in questions, is consensus is good when we're faced with binary options. One of those binary options, for example, is going to be your answers to the questions at the end of this debate, right? That's a binary choice. So premise 1 will be, assume that there are only 2 choices, yes, and either Cooldog or Spaz will win. Assume people on average are better than random at selecting between the two, which my opponent conceded. And so then 3, once we assume that there's a large set of people, then the rule of large numbers kicks, and we can conclude that through this rule of large number and through these premises, that it is more likely, given a binary choice, that the average or the group of people are going to be more correct than any one particular individual. So that's a reason to prefer consensus, is that it usually reaches truth when we're dealing with binary options. The second contention is going to be that consensus is better than following the minority, right? And the reason is this allows for fairness. I think the tyranny of minority is much worse than the tyranny of majority, right? because at least when you have a majority consensus, most people are along with it. When you have a minority consensus, then that's called tyranny, right? It avoids the ability for a small minority to, basically dictate the majority, and it also hedges against the possibility of error for, when we're abandoning consensus and we're letting small groups of people that don't represent the majority, which would necessarily be anti-consensus, right, the minority opinion, then we're not allowing more minds to decide on the issue, and we're including more possibility for error than when we use a larger set. The third contention is sort of an ethical contention, is that the opposite of consensus must mean that what the majority thinks is wrong, right? And I think that can't clearly be the case. There is consensus, for example, in murder. Murder is wrong. Cold-blooded murder is wrong for no self-defense reasons, right? And if we reject consensus there, if we're rejecting consensus, then that must mean that we must reject that murder is wrong, because we can't follow consensus and consensus isn't valuable. So that's the third contention. The fourth contention, which is quite fun, is that my opponent is disrespecting you, the audience member, and thinking that your votes don't matter because the consensus of who wins this debate doesn't matter. If your opinion doesn't matter, then like, why are we here? Why are we even making a vote? Why are we debating if consensus doesn't matter? So if you think that your vote matters and your opinion matters for who decides this debate, then you should vote for me. I think that the audience does matter and your vote does matter. So in that sense, I think it's a clear vote for me as an audience member. So now let's get into the specifics of the case that my opponent presented. The first contention was basically let's see. So the first contention was about the fact that the majority isn't necessarily correct, right? My opponent questions the value of consensus and quotes studies that say that when the consensus is reached, it makes it harder for people to think critically or formulate dissenting opinions, and it's sort of like apparently it like railroads the discourse once the consensus is reached. My point here is that my opponent, and we got to this sort of in the questioning part, I kind of signposted this, right, is the fact that his problem isn't with consensus properly speaking, and the debate topic is about consensus. It's not about the discourse norms that go around with it, right? If people are weaponizing consensus as a way to prevent discourse from continuing, then obviously that's bad, but that's bad for different reasons. It's not consensus itself which is the problem here, right? So if you think that discourse norms need to be reformed or that consensus can be weaponized, that's perfectly compatible with still valuing consensus and majority opinion and the meeting of minds together to discuss issues and understand what's going on, right? I mean, adding on to this, we use consensus in scientific and medical fields, for example. Are we to discount what the scientific community has reached a consensus on because it supposedly railroads people to finding the truth? Heck no. I'm going to stick with the medical consensus when I have an illness and trust my doctor and the institution of medicine, which is based upon consensus as well. The second real contention was the democratic reasons, right? I think we covered some of this. The fact of the matter remains is that we don't live in a direct democracy. We live based in a representative democracy where through our two-party system, at least in America, right, we have binary options and we basically have a consensus about who's going to represent us. And then there's a consensus of those representatives that end up making the decisions. Right, so it's not that we have this direct democracy problem that my opponent is saying. And again, I'm going to fall back on my previous argument that I made, which was my contention one, which is about the binary options choosing. Right, like we're selecting the best representatives from the pool through this consensus making process. Of course, we cannot deliberate about every single issue, but through the power of consensus, we can create a more efficient democracy than if we were to listen to the minority or fringe opinions all the time, right? You need some consensus at the end of the day between these representatives in order to end up making an actual decision. So then thirdly, moving on to the tyranny of majority argument, is this idea. I still am not understanding why a tyranny of majority is in any way worse than a tyranny of a minority, right? At least I will be fine to grant that in both schemes oppression exists, but I would rather be the majority interest be kept of the population than the minorities, right? I mean, if we're going to be good utilitarians about our public policy, or even like from other ethical perspectives, I think that allowing the minority to somehow override the majority seems to be absurd. I don't see this tyranny of the majority. I think the tyranny of the minority is much more concerning, especially when we look at like historical fascist movements, which were they arose from minority opinion initially. So to recap, the reasons you're voting for me is the binary options contention that I made, the fact that we use consensus in our daily lives for practical reasons like science and medicine, doing what the minority thinks is prima facie probably wrong to railroad the majority for the minority. And then fourth, of course, is going to be the contention that you, their audience members' opinion matters. If you think that, you should vote for me.
Okay, thanks. So, Spaz, you can hop in with your 3-minute cross-examination now, if you'd like.
Okay, cool. So, Cooldog, you were talking about the value that the scientific community places on consensus.
Correct.
But you would have to agree that there's a lot of utility, if not an outright necessity, in individual scientists or individual doctors using their own judgment to form the consensus in the first place, right?
Well, yes, of course. But I mean, this is why we have meta-analyses, right? As a form of consensus making among these various independent studies, right?
Right, but I'm not talking about meta-analysis. So you can see how if we have individuals within the group deciding based on consensus themselves, then we're just going to have sort of a circular reasoning situation. So it seems like it's necessary whenever we're putting value on consensus that there be some criteria other than consensus that allows the individual to.
Well, sure, but I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's global. I mean, we can say that there's utility in saying that the scientific community has a consensus that global warming exists, right? And we don't have to look at every single individual study and make up our, there's practical utility in saying things like this and referring to consensus in this instance.
Okay. Don't you think the utility in being able to refer to consensus comes from the fact that I assume you and me are both laymen on that topic?
Correct.
So we were never the ones who were supposed to be making that decision in the first place.
Well, yeah, right.
Okay. So another sort of scenario, let's say that we have a situation where I'm a patient and at my bedside are my mom, a doctor, and a nurse.
Okay.
And we're trying to make a decision whether I should go in for surgery. You would agree that everyone present is going to have a say in what happened. Like everybody,
Right.
I'm going to want to, but you would also agree that the way we're making that decision is not by consensus, and it actually can't be.
Indirectly, consensus plays a part in it in like the art of medicine, right? The consensus reached in the medical field
I'm
that you
talking
need
about
surgery for this type of thing is what's
but at the
informing the
hospital
doctor.
bed, while I'm in the
No,
hospital bed, we're not talking about consensus.
I will agree that there are instances where decisions are made where consensus is not the deciding factor. Yes.
Okay. And do you know of any way to distinguish a priori whether we should or shouldn't use consensus?
I think in terms of politics, I think that might be a candidate.
Okay. I think
But
the
for
question
personal
is,
decisions, I don't think that you can a priori know that consensus will or will not be required.
Okay, that's time for the cross-examination. So, Spaz, you can move on to your 4-minute first affirmative rebuttal, if you'd like.
okay, so I'm going to go through my opponent's critiques of my argument. So I think the first contention was that it would always be better for the majority view to take precedence over the minority view. But this doesn't seem to be true at all, because, for instance, we don't know whether the minority view might be, say, the view of an electrician about how a house should be wired versus the view of like 3 laymen. It seems like there are obviously situations where decision-making procedures other than consensus are going to be the best option. And you can say that any criticism I have of consensus isn't necessarily intrinsic to consensus. But the issue is that if we accept something as a decision-making procedure, then we're necessarily committing ourselves to whatever the consequences are, be they good or bad. And so the only thing we can do is pick something that's most likely to get us the best result. And in my view, that's just not going to be any kind of decision by consensus. My opponent was bringing up the idea of people sort of being individually more likely to choose correctly between binary options. And then we're using the law of large numbers to know what the best result is by what most people pick. But this doesn't seem to work for me, because this is actually disregarding consensus by its very nature, since it relies on each individual making their own decision and then just sort of post hoc weighing them up. If we were making this decision based on consensus, there would actually be a problem, because just like it was demonstrated in Ash's conformity experiment, either the first person to start speaking or just the loudest person is going to be disproportionately influential over the views of others, which could cause problems that would actually make me a lot less inclined. Like, I would be less inclined to trust people guessing at the gumball game, for example, if I knew that they were allowed to talk about it, than if I knew they weren't allowed to talk about it. So I think that's just about my time.
Oh, you still have like 2 minutes left.
Oh shit! Yeah, I think I missed. I thought you said 30 seconds. Okay, cool. So some of the views. I think it's really important to make a distinction between the concept of consensus and the value, which I think everybody should agree with. Everybody should agree that there's value in accepting the input of multiple people. The contention I have is I think it's actually pretty difficult to weigh up multiple people's views or multiple sources of information. We sort of muddy the waters by having this sort of like a consensus-based discourse. I think the best way that I can see to make these decisions is to have multiple people independently use their own judgment, and then afterwards we can sort of weigh up who seemed to say what, or what the majority view was. But we're creating problems when we make decisions, especially about things like science and medicine, by an attempt to reach consensus before. Oh shit. So for my final point, I think it's important to the reason why majority tyranny might be seen as worse than minoritarian rule is just because the former seems to be more likely and less there's more room for a sort of brutality, whereas minoritarian rule is on the one hand less likely to be seen as moral at all, and so we're less likely to ever have any decision. I think I'm just about done with time.
Yeah,
See.
you're just out.
Okay.
Okay, so Cooldog, we can move on to your 6-minute negative rebuttal if you'd like.
Alrighty then. Okay, yeah. Thank my opponent again for the great rebuttal there. So I think what the issue that seems to be, there's several issues that seem to be continually rearing their head. First, I'm going to tackle the scientific argument, and then the tyranny of majority, which I sort of have on his case, and then I'll do refutations of the binary options and the other stuff. So on the scientific question, my opponent says that we should use individual basically studies, and then from those studies we can then draw like our opinion based upon those. I think that that's wholly irresponsible, especially in the medical profession, when reading every single individual study is like impossible, right? You need some guidelines that compile various information and synthesize them into a consensus opinion about what to do about various things. In other sciences, this is called a meta-analysis, right? And that's I take that to be a form of consensus. On the tyranny of the majority point, he says that the tyranny of the majority is more brutal in some way and is not seen as prima facie like moral by the people there. And I think that that's like a gross sort of mischaracterization of how like tyranny from the minority ends up turning into the oppressive tyranny of the majority once it takes its root, once we give in to fringe opinions that aren't subject to the total population's consensus of it or the majority consensus on a topic, then you're giving up sort of your stake in it, and you're letting these fringe views take over, and then eventually they come to dominate the discourse through their own need for more brutality because they do not have the force of the majority there. So, in fact, I would argue that the tyranny from a minority is more brutal of the necessity to gain legitimacy and by the nature of it being a minority. Okay, so going on to the binary options part of my case, I still think I win this argument, right? He says that I somehow disregard specific opinions or individuals' opinions upon things, and he runs his conformity case again. All I want to say is that my opponent conceded that during questioning that the rules of large numbers does kick in this way, and that people are better than average than random at making these binary options. So I don't see why a system of aggregating opinion wouldn't approach the truth more easily than not, right? That's the whole point of the rule of large numbers. And again, his conformity arguments don't matter at all because, again, in questioning, he admitted that there's nothing wrong about consensus in the abstract about these conformity being a problem, people yelling louder, and then therefore people will be hesitant to raise counter opinions to that, right? That has nothing to do with consensus, properly speaking. That's just about discourse norms that we have. We can still have a deliberative system where people are given a fair shake or are allowed to discuss among themselves, right? Or to theorize separately and then synthesize at the end of it a consensus. And it's kind of funny because that's one of the arguments that my opponent is running is like we should have everybody individually and then we should look at post facto what happens. Like after the fact, we're supposed to look at what these people as individuals said. And quite clearly that's just a way of doing consensus. So like my opponent admits in his own speech that consensus matters in this sense of the word, which I think is a form of consensus, right? He talks about, for example, that sometimes you don't, when there's not a binary option. Sort of my second point is that like if an electrician comes to your house, you should trust the individual's expertise over consensus. Well, again, I'm just going to appeal to the fact that in working in the field, a consensus arises about how to like wire your house, for example. What are the norms and the good things to do for that? And then people over time reach sort of an informal consensus about the way that things should be done, the way that things should be fixed, best, industry best practices and things like this. And these are arrived at a form of consensus, right? So then sort of summarizing some of the important voting issues for why you're going to vote for me are, again, the admission that the binary options thing kicks, right? The fact that the tyranny of the minority, which my opponent necessarily, by rejecting the consensus of the minority, has to admit to, he wants the minority opinion by definition, right? This is going to lead to a more brutal tyranny of the minority. Two, that's the second reason. The third reason that you're probably going to vote for me is the fact that we use, as I've said before, we use the consensus of various institutions and intellectual communities in order to better live our lives. It has brought us great utility, great ability to prevent diseases by referring to the medical consensus, for example, the consensus of scientists generally, for example, and there is great utility in doing that. And then the fourth reason, again, which my opponent has not refuted, is the fact that your vote matters. Your vote in this poll matters. And so if you think that your vote is meaningful and the consensus of the audience here is meaningful, then you have to side with me, because voting for my opponent makes absolutely no sense from your perspective, right? Because you're just throwing it into the black box that doesn't matter. So why even vote in the first place, right? You should reject voting if you agree with his points. But obviously you are going to vote, and so for that reason, you should vote for me. So with that, I believe I will be resting my case.
Okay, and then lastly, after we do this, it'll satisfy the format. If you want to do your 3-minute second affirmative rebuttal, Spaz, you can go ahead.
Okay, cool. So my opponent has brought up like the concept of a meta-analysis a few times. And what I don't understand is why that's being equated to a consensus. Because, for example, it's actually really common that a meta-analysis is used to clear up what would be actually sort of contentious amongst the studies that are being like summarized. So it's not necessarily the case that a meta-analysis or sort of aggregating opinion has anything at all to do with consensus. I don't think that makes any sense, really. I also don't grant that just because we reject majority rule that we're somehow granting some kind of like tyranny of the majority or of the minority inevitably. Because like in the example of the hospital example, there's plenty of ways we can have of respecting either the input or the rights of individuals without necessarily making any decisions at all by consensus. I do grant that the law of large numbers is going to help us know, or is going to help us make decisions in some cases, but there's not really any, like I was saying earlier, I think a precondition for consensus is for a group of people to discuss the issue and to come to a sort of agreement or to come to solidarity about what to do. And I don't think that has anything at all to do with the law of large numbers. Like I think it could actually, in a lot of cases, it can be problematic to allow people to discuss issues before they come to a conclusion, at least in some cases, because then we're depriving ourselves of access to their individual judgment. There are a lot of examples in science where somebody who actually just didn't realize what the consensus was at the time has actually made an important discovery, because given that they didn't have access to consensus, they were forced to rely on their own judgment. And I think just like how my opponent is talking about the idea that rejecting consensus disrespects the votes of the voters, I would disagree with that completely, because what I advocate for is the same thing that is the same rule that I also apply when I vote on these polls, is that I use my own judgment. I try to decide who I think wins. And frankly, I don't care what the consensus is, because my vote is made according to what I believe to be true. And that is the procedure that I would urge the audience to use when deciding who to vote for. And I'll go ahead and conclude my case.